Since the planting of the cross at Cape Henry in 1607, when English settlers dedicated this new world to God and the gospel, American history has recorded an uncanny pattern. At moments of crisis, when it seems disaster is imminent, something else happens time and time again, deliverance from crisis and progress toward a better future. Author Michael Medved says America's blessings are not due to random chance, but a reflection of God's guidance and intervention. In his new book, The American Miracle, Divine Providence in the Rise of the Republic, the best-selling author and radio host tells about some of the most significant events in America's rise to prosperity and power. And he reveals that what's at the heart of it all is what the founders always believed, that events of our nation's history unfolded not by accident, but according to a providential master plan.
Well, this is a book. It's called The American Miracle, Divine Providence in the Rise of the Republic. What a wonderful thing to give to somebody for Christmas, I might add. It's just out, and I understand on Amazon, so-called Movers and Shakers has come out #1. Tremendous book, Divine Providence in the Rise of the Republic. And Michael Medved, a dear friend, is here with us. Michael, good to see you.
Thank you. Great to see you,
Thank you. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, or whatever.
Thank you. No, Merry Christmas is fine.
That's right. Right.
President-elect Trump has said we can say Merry Christmas again.
Finally again, after 8 years of political correctness. I want to ask you a couple things in here, but you started out talking about the 50th anniversary, July the 4th, and that just seemed like another day, and yet extraordinary things happened. Talk about it.
Well, it did, and first of all, it's a reminder of how deeply conscious our founders were of our biblical roots, because that was the Jubilee year, which is Yovel in Hebrew, and in fact, on the Liberty Bell, it quotes Leviticus. It says, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof." People felt incredibly lucky, July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, because both Jefferson and Adams were alive. Adams, the guy who fought in the Continental Congress for independence, Jefferson, who actually wrote the Declaration, they're both alive. And Adams was 90 years old. Jefferson was 83. Extraordinary for those days. And yet, on that day, on July 4th, both men died.
Well, Adams said Jefferson lives. He thought he was still alive.
Correct, and he had died 6 hours before, because, of course, then news couldn't travel any faster than a galloping horse. But here's the amazing thing. I found this funeral oration, this tribute to these two great men, that was delivered by Daniel Webster. And Webster, who was a religiously tormented guy, he had a little bit of a drinking problem, but he gave this great speech in Faneuil Hall where he said, this removes all doubt, because, and again, people have calculated the odds. They are the only two presidents ever who had ever died on the same day. Only 2 of 3 presidents who died on the 4th of July. James Monroe, the 5th president, died on the 4th of July 5 years later. But the fact that it was the 50th 4th of July, and they were the people involved, people have said that's about the chances of drawing a royal flush in poker 45 times in a row. It's not coincidental. And that's just a small hint of what's involved here.
But, you know, this whole thing about American exceptionalism, our sitting president was said is exceptional. Yeah, well, the Indians are exceptional, and this is exceptional. What about, it is an exceptional country, isn't it?
It is, and again, you ask yourself, to go back to a poker analogy. If you're playing poker and there's somebody who wins hand after hand after hand, you think there's something going on. It's what I call a rigged game. Take the Louisiana Purchase, where Alexander Hamilton, again, who was a religiously unconventional, he said this has to have been Providence, because he didn't want to give credit to his old rival Jefferson. That's part of it. But the point is, Napoleon Bonaparte, think about that. You know history as well as anybody. Napoleon is noted for grabbing land, grabbing territory. Here he gives away territory that's later 15 states of the United States. It's territory 4 times the size of France. And he gives it. Why? There's a combination of circumstances. There was a Harvard professor in the 1950s, again, not a religious believer, but he said, this couldn't have happened except for a miraculous weather event that occurred in Holland, where in a place called Helvoetsluis, Miraculously, this huge freeze came over, froze the harbor, so Napoleon's fleet couldn't leave, which was planning to hold Louisiana.
I thought it was just to keep Haiti, but it's not true.
No, because Haiti was already lost. Napoleon's brother-in-law, and that's the other thing, the only successful slave rebellion in all of human history, the only one, was in Haiti. And that had to occur for Louisiana to have been passed to the United States. That's just part of it. Of course, some of the most amazing so-called coincidences, miracles.
One you have in here was Sam Houston, who was a drinker and had an Indian consort. I don't know if she was a wife or what she was.
Historians sort of fudge that one.
Right. But something happened, the Battle of San Jacinto, and Santa Anna, according to your book, was captured, and he shouldn't have been captured. And what happened as a result of that battle?
None of this should have happened. I mean, because, first of all, the Texans were not fighting to take, quote, Mexico. I mean, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that at the time in 1837, that they fought for independence from Mexico, the population of Texas was 90% American. And Sam Houston was only there because he had a terrible wedding night, because he drank too much. He was governor of Tennessee. He had a terrible wedding night, very deep embarrassment. We don't know exactly what happened, but we have some idea.
All right.
He resigned as governor, went out to live with the Cherokees, started drinking too much, got a new Indian name. His old Indian name had been Kalona, the Raven. Now he was known as Big Drunk. And so finally, he sort of stumbles down toward Texas because he sees an eagle flying in front of him that leads him in that direction. And had he not been there, remember, Santa Anna had massacred the 180 people at the Alamo. He had massacred 900 people at Goliad. He was killing the Americans, totally destroyed, 18 minutes from beginning to end, the Battle of San Jacinto. And there is no explanation for what happened.
Was seeing a raven. He went with Indian shamans and signs.
And he did, and at the end of his life, he became a Baptist. He finally, part of this problem with the wedding night was the allegation was that he had been wounded. He had been wounded in an embarrassing place during the Battle of Horseshoe Bend many, many years before. But in any event, the point is, he met this beautiful young woman who was a graduate of Bible college even then, married her. They ended up having 8 children, and toward the end of his life, he made a very sincere conversion. And that story is amazing. And he saw his own role, because Texas would not be part of the United States of America without this remarkable man.
Here is a small ragtag group of so-called Texicans fighting the army, and Santa Anna, the great general, and he's president of Mexico, and he's having dalliances with these girls on a hot summer.
No, you're exactly right, Pat. I'm so glad, you know, that you're aware of this history. Most people aren't. Santa Anna called himself the Napoleon of the West and the savior of the motherland. And he served 11 different terms that he basically appointed himself as president of Mexico. He's a very, very questionable guy. And had he not engaged in what people would say euphemistically as a dalliance on the afternoon of this battle at San Jacinto, which is where the city of Houston is today, all of world history would have been different. Because, again, this is not only the state of Texas, it's New Mexico and Arizona as well. And this brings us forward to another amazement. Gold is discovered in California. In January 24th, we're told, 1848. It's at virtually the same moment that a clerk in the State Department is defying President Polk, risking arrest, because Polk had fired him. He's supposed to be negotiating with the Mexicans. Polk fired him, said, come home. He said no. Polk sent troops down to arrest him. Meanwhile, Nicholas Trist is just so focused on signing this treaty and getting California for America. As the treaty is being signed, they discover gold at Sutter's Mill. It changes all of American history because it was that gold that gave America the economic power. We suddenly had the biggest gold reserves in the world because of California, which only became part of America the moment that gold is discovered.
Well, we wouldn't have had all that west without the Battle of San Jacinto. I mean, it triggered all the way down the line, right?
No, without question, that's true. And that's one of the things about the interconnectedness of so much of this, because that Nicholas Trist, who I just mentioned, who was this State Department clerk who defied a president to win California, he was married to Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter. And when Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, it was Nicholas Trist who heard his last words and held his hand and was right with the great man.
The same one who brought in California?
Correct.
Unbelievable.
And Nicholas was the private secretary to Andrew Jackson. Now, again, this has been ripped out of our history, and part of what I'm trying to do in my book is to bring it back. The Battle of New Orleans, which is the greatest victory, completely inexplicable. Over 2,000 Brits who were casualties. 7 Americans died. They thought it was totally miraculous. Part of what happened here is there's a convent in New Orleans. It was the first convent built in North America by the Ursuline nuns. And they were praying for General Jackson and the Americans, and they were praying earnestly. And the Mother Superior declared that if God gave the Americans the victory and protected New Orleans from this British invasion, that then forevermore they would celebrate that day as a feast day to Our Lady. And in any event, while they were celebrating Mass on Sunday, the word came in, miraculous news, the British are defeated. Here's the other thing, is Andrew Jackson, who's a Presbyterian, came to visit the nuns and thanked them for their prayers, which he said helped to enable the victory. And by the way, that order in New Orleans, they still celebrate that as a day of fasting and prayer to this day.
Catapulted him to the presidency. He became president of the United States.
Of course. And he was the first president to ever have an attempt on his life. Now, here's another thing. It's 1835. He's coming out of the Capitol building. He was attending a funeral of a congressman from South Carolina who's a political ally. And a crazy guy, British national, Jackson always had problems with the British. British national comes up to President Jackson, who's at the end of his second term, and he's an old man. And the British national, whose name was Richard Lawrence, takes out a pistol. And from 6 feet away, he fires at the president. And Senator Benton, who heard the whole thing, said you could hear the shot ringing out under the Capitol dome, because this was in the Capitol building. The pistol misfired. Jackson, who's stunned, picks up his cane, and he starts hitting. He takes out his second pistol and fires it directly against the president's chest. It misfires. They later tested the pistols, the federal authorities. They were functioning perfectly. What they say is a misfire where the powder actually ignites, and you hear this report, and boom, and it doesn't touch the president. The odds against that are 250,000 to 1.
So God supernaturally saved his life. Why?
Well, one would say because Jackson believed that God had protected him from the time he was a little boy. When he was 13 years old, he was fighting in the American Revolution. A British officer takes his sword and brings the sword down on Jackson's head. He shields his head, he's 13, with his hand. He always had that scar. But had he not shielded his hand at the last minute, he would have died then. He almost dies right before the Battle of New Orleans. He gets involved in a tavern brawl. That's the kind of guy he was. But he's shot, and he's almost bleeding to death. The doctors are planning to amputate his arm because they told Mrs. Jackson it's the only way he could possibly live. They have the saws out. They're getting ready to go, amputate his right arm. And all of a sudden, he opens his bright blue eyes, and he looks at them, and he says, I think I'll keep the arm, thank you. And because he kept the arm, they strap him to his horse, and he rides off to save the country in the Battle of New Orleans. He believed that he was protected for a purpose to serve his country. And by the way, it follows George Washington. You've written about this.
Oh, yes.
George Washington was indestructible. And people around him, including Native Americans, they believed that bullets couldn't touch him.
Great spirit was upon him, that's right.
And he died yesterday, December 14th, 1799, at the very end of the century that he dominated with his exemplary life.
Michael, this is incredible. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've got to get this book. It's just too much in here, but it's a thrill to hear the recount of what this nation, how God himself looked after America, the American miracle. And my goodness, well, I hope this is a great success. Michael, this is a triumph. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Pat.
God bless you.
And Merry Christmas.
And to you, sir. Michael Medved, a tremendous friend and a wonderful author, The American Miracle.
From the Mayflower Compact to the Declaration of Independence, Christianity was at the heart of America's founding. That key point is often overlooked these days, but the evidence is everywhere. Paul Strand reports on a massive revival in the 1700s that left a radical mark on the birth of our nation.
America's revolutionary fathers weren't just nominal Christians. They were profoundly influenced by the New World's first revival, the Great Awakening. Reverend Eddie Hyatt tells how it hit from the 1720s to 60s in his book, America's Revival Heritage. Colonial pastor Jonathan Edwards, known to pray and study his Bible 13 hours a day, watched radical revival take over his hometown in Massachusetts.
The way he describes it is just like one day God invaded the town of Northampton. The town seemed to be full of the presence of God.
The bars emptied out and Christians' homes filled with people anxious to be saved and know God.
He said if you came across someone who seemed spiritually indifferent, it would be spoken of as a strange thing.
Then the powerful English preacher George Whitefield brought his fiery sermons to America. Scorned by the established church, he preached salvation to huge multitudes outdoors. Crowds from 10,000 to as many as 30,000 showed up.
Entire towns repenting and turning to God.
Whitefield stayed at Benjamin Franklin's home while preaching in Philadelphia, and Franklin wrote of the revival's impact.
From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street.
Whitefield lifted up a special prayer for the colonies that would make a huge difference in their revolution and future together.
They would not live as 13 scattered colonies, but as one nation under God.
And indeed, the Great Awakening became the first national event the scattered colonies experienced as one. It unified them unlike any time before, just in time to face the mighty British Empire in war. The revival also shaped the Founding Fathers' core vision for America, that God sets men free. It's their natural right to have liberty, and each is made to rule with Christ. Its influence is all over their Declaration of Independence, U.S. Constitution, and Bill of Rights. As he studied the founders, Hyatt found example after example of how deeply this awakening influenced them and their Christian values. Take Thomas Jefferson, for instance.
He signed all presidential documents in the year of our Lord Christ.
He sent Christian missionaries to one Indian tribe and gave them federal funds to build a church. He also attended Sunday services held in the House of Representatives. Some scholars even doubt the first president's faith. But a Quaker named Isaac Potts, living near Valley Forge, saw George Washington's faith up close during that cruel winter that almost froze his colonial army to death during the Revolution.
He said, I tied my horse to a sapling and went quietly into the woods, and to my astonishment, I saw the great George Washington on his knees alone. He was at prayer to the God of the armies of heaven, beseeching him.
The anti-war Quaker Potts later wrote,
and he says, such a prayer I never heard from the lips of man. We never thought a man could be a soldier and a Christian. But if there is one in the world, it is Washington.
At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the delegates fought and bickered so bitterly the convention almost broke up. But then Ben Franklin stood and began to preach.
He says, the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid?
Then Franklin beseeched them to pray together at the start of every day. After that, an atmosphere of peace and reconciliation came upon the founders.
And they were able to proceed and to finish their job of hammering out the American Constitution and Bill of Rights, and in a context of prayer.
60 years after it began, the Great Awakening still influenced the Founding Fathers and continues to benefit our country today. Paul Strand, CBN News. Here at Plymouth Plantation, near the site of the actual Pilgrim settlement, reenactors portray a hardy, thriving Plymouth several years after the settlers arrived. Their radical faith in a living God is displayed in recreations of a Sunday service.
Let thy Spirit guide us in these and all our actions for thy glory and the good of thine elect.
But years before, it took miracle after miracle for the Pilgrims to survive their first few months in the New World and make it to their first Thanksgiving. Pilgrim reenactor Leo Martin gives tours in the city of Plymouth out of the Jenny Museum he helps run. He says these religious separatists were unshakable, determined people not to be trifled with. One Pilgrim-hating sailor on the Mayflower found out it didn't pay to curse them or their God.
Finally looked at him and said, I cannot wait until you fools die, and I can put your bodies in a shroud and dump you into the ocean, you hymn-singing puke stockings. Well, the next week he died, the Pilgrims put his body in a shroud and dumped him into the ocean. And to this day, nobody knows what killed him.
Still, when they landed way off course to the north, the cruel, harsh winter of 1620 killed half of these tough Pilgrims. Dr. Paul Jaley reenacts and heads the Plymouth Rock Foundation, which highlights the Pilgrims' die-hard, flinty faith.
They start out talking about 2 or 3 people dying a day. So half their company is dead.
Nearly out of food, they were living on a ration of just 5 kernels of corn a day, and most of the mothers perished because they gave their portions to their starving children.
Those 18 married women, 14 died the first winter, sacrificing themselves for the next generation.
But even in the midst of all this, the guidance of God was evident. Exploring in their shallop boat, they found, here above the famous Plymouth Rock, a place that perfectly, miraculously met their needs. A river of fresh, clean water teeming with fish. Next to it, a high hill, now a cemetery, but then the perfect location for their cannon set to ward off Spanish, French, or native enemies. And since they couldn't fit plows on the Mayflower, they desperately needed a large plowed field no longer claimed by anyone.
They find 3 acres of cleared farmland, which the natives have abandoned.
Because a plague had killed most of them.
Now they're wiped out by a plague, so no other Indians would come on the property.
Then Martin tells CBN News of one of the strangest occurrences of all. An unknown Indian walked up and spoke English.
How you doing? You got a beer?
He led them to a young brave named Squanto, taken under the wing of this man, friendly Chief Massasoit of the nearby Wampanoag tribe.
Taken captive earlier by the Britons and made a slave, Squanto had escaped, learned English in Britain, and had now returned. He taught the Pilgrims how to plant the native maize, or corn.
And it did save them, because the wheat, rye, and barley they brought with them wouldn't take to the sandy soil the corn did.
And he showed them how to use the plentiful fish in this river as fertilizer to make the corn grow well.
Squanto was this providential instrument used by God.
By the next fall, the crop had thrived enough, the Pilgrims decided to celebrate and give thanks to God, inviting Massasoit and his immediate family to come feast with them.
Unfortunately, nobody explained to Massasoit the meaning of immediate family. He brought 99 braves.
First Thanksgiving went on for 3 days as English settlers and natives feasted and celebrated side by side. But the Pilgrims didn't forget that starving time that killed half their number.
Governor Bradford put 5 kernels of corn on everybody's plate and asked everybody there to give him 5 things they were thankful for that first year in Plymouth. And that's what we consider our first Thanksgiving.
Plymouth honors the Pilgrims year-round through such things as its national monument to the forefathers, topped by a female figure titled Faith. This commemoration included an Abraham Lincoln reenactor, since it was Lincoln who in 1863 made Thanksgiving a national holiday.
The fact of the matter is, the Almighty deals with us as nations as well as individuals.
And much of the nation makes its gratitude known every Thanksgiving to the God whose divine hand guided through terrible trials these brave, determined Pilgrims. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from Plymouth, Massachusetts.
During the drafting of the American Constitution in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin was asked, "What do we have, a republic or a monarchy?" To which Franklin famously replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." More than 200 years later, author Eric Metaxas says the American people have largely forgotten what it takes to maintain the world's most successful democracy. And he says it's time that we rededicate ourselves to the ideas that the Founding Fathers set forth in 1787 before we lose them forever. His new book, If You Can Keep It, is a stirring call to action for every American to understand the ideals behind the noble experiment in ordered liberty that is America.
Well, Eric Metaxas is here to tell us about his book. The title intriguing, If You Can Keep It, The Forgotten Promise of American Liberty. Eric, good to see you.
Great to be here. Thank you, Pat.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. A lady asked Benjamin Franklin, what did you guys give us? And he said, we gave you a republic if you can keep it. You and I know what a republic is, but what do you think he meant by republic? What was he giving us?
He was talking about self-government, and he was talking about, I mean, I write about this in the book because I realized, the reason I wrote the book is that I realized I myself had not learned these things growing up. I went to decent public schools. Yeah. I went to a horrible university called Yale University. Are you familiar with that?
Awful.
Let's not talk about it. But the point is that for the last 50 or so years, we've not been teaching these things. And so the more I learned about it, the more I realized if we don't teach this, if we don't learn what I put in the book, we're in trouble. And Franklin said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. We always think of that as kind of like a cute joke. He said, if you can keep it. Well, it's a haunting, chilling thing because I believe that Franklin and all of the founders understood that what they were giving us, self-government, because it had never been done before in the history of the world, was tremendously fragile, and there was a genuine question as to whether the people could pull it off, because it was up to the people. So when Franklin said that, I don't think he was just being cute. I think he was saying, this is serious. If you want self-government and liberty, you must do some things. And I really believe there were probably conversations in the Constitutional Convention. Will this work?
Well, they thought we'd go back to monarchy.
Well, there's no question, and people don't realize that that was very real. I mean, that, as you know, the history from 1776 until 1787, we had the Articles of Confederation, and it wasn't working. It was not working. It was so bad that they had to go back to the drawing board and have the Constitutional Convention. So I think that the conversations they had as they created the Constitution were, will this work? And they all understood, every single one of the founders understood, that it is genuinely up to the people. This is not just a nice idea, that if the people don't keep it, if the people don't do their job to govern themselves, it will not work, it will fail. And at the heart of it all is faith and virtue. We've not been talking about this for 50 years, so I'm a man on a mission. I've never been as excited in my life about anything I've ever written. I want to put this in the hands of every American because I believe our republic is genuinely at stake.
Well, what you say, it is at stake because we must be governed by people of virtue. If they're not
people of virtue,
we're in trouble.
Yeah. Well, when I say virtue, first of all, you know, this doesn't mean that we need to elect a president who doesn't smoke and who hasn't done anything wrong in his past. We're talking about what happens in a republic is that once the people feel that the leader is in it for himself or herself, once the people believe there's corruption, they bow out of the system. They no longer bother to vote or to be engaged citizens. And so we need leaders who really, the people have the sense that these people really do care about their country. But also, the people themselves have to be people of virtue. That's not taught in the schools anymore, that democracy doesn't work unless the people are virtuous enough to govern themselves.
The Supreme Court has hammered away at the whole concept of religious liberty. I mean, it's unbelievable what's had the last 5, 6 decades.
Well, this is why I'm horrified right now. You know, when I write this book, this is not something for our future. If we don't take this stuff seriously immediately during this election season and in the years to come, if we don't get this right now, I say it's game over. We'll become America in name only, which is, you know, we'll be a European socialist democracy, except we'll still be called America, but we won't really be the America that the founders gave us.
Exceptionalism. You've got a big thing in here about the American exceptionalism. What do you see as that, and why is it important?
Well, what I say is that what makes America genuinely exceptional is the fact that we are not here for ourselves. From the beginning, we have understood, and it's a fundamentally biblical idea, we've understood from the beginning that we're the nation for the whole world. We're not an ethnic group. We say to anyone in the world, like my parents from Greece and Germany, you can be as American as George Washington. This is not an ethnic group. Anyone who buys into these ideas can become an American. And so American exceptionalism doesn't mean, hey, we're great. What it means is we're great because we know we're not great. It's like it's the same as the Christian idea that, you know, I'm saved, but I know that I don't deserve it. And I know that it's so wonderful, I want to share it with the whole world. Sure. America is founded on this idea that we want to share our liberties with anybody who's interested. We want to help people around the world who are suffering. We're a nation for others. And that's such a beautiful idea that it is exceptional in world history.
You know, John Adams quoted as saying, you know, this Constitution was written for a moral and a religious people as wholly inadequate for the government of any other.
Right.
That still applies, doesn't it?
Well, it applies, but what I discovered, and this is to me the shock, and this is why I'm so excited about this book, is I realized that it wasn't just John Adams, it was every single one of the founders. Franklin, Jefferson, we think of them as more secular, more, you know, French Enlightenment deists. They and every one of the founders understood that without a people of virtue, there is no way that this can work. So that's an idea that if every single one of the founders bought into that idea, how is it that we're not teaching that in our schools? How is it that if you're watching TV or going to movies, you never hear these ideas? Without these ideas, America is destined to go away.
Well, if somebody talks about a moral and religious people, suddenly they're, quote, violating the separation of church and state, and they're imposing their views on somebody else. And it goes down the line of every...
It's fundamentally the opposite of what the founders intended. I talk about that as well in the book, that the concept of separation of church and state is not only misunderstood, but we're teaching the opposite of what the founders said. And again, when I say the founders, I'm talking Jefferson, Franklin, every one of them, not a few Christians. Every one of the founders.
Well, how's the book doing?
Well, I haven't been able to promote it much, so I'm glad that I'm here. It hit the New York Times bestseller list when it first came out, but I'm doing it. I've never been more passionate about a book, Pat. If I could get this in the hand of every American, I really believe that if we don't learn these things, and again, I wasn't taught these things in school. Most people listening weren't taught these things in school. If we don't relearn the fundamentals of why this is a great nation, we will go away and the whole world will suffer. And so if you care about Mexico, if you care about China, if you care about the rest of the world, you need to care about America.
Well, the kids don't learn this in school.
That's right.
None of them.
Well, again, that's why I'm using the free market. You know, I wrote a book that anyone can get it and anybody can read. There are stories in here that are so inspiring, they brought tears to my eyes. And I felt ashamed that I didn't know these stories, because I want the whole world to know the heroes that have given their lives. I talk about Nathan Hale and Washington and others. They did things so great that it's a sin and a crime not to be teaching these stories.
A statue of Hale that was defaced by students at Yale. Talk about that.
Well, this is, when I discovered this, I could not believe it. It was like something, like a joke. I realized that the story of Nathan Hale is one of those stories that when you understand it, he was a very devout Christian and one of the great heroes of liberty in the United States of America. There's a statue at Yale because his dorm is still there at Yale. So they put up a statue in 1914, beautiful statue, but you never hear of any kind of heroism. We don't talk about heroism or patriotism or anything like that. And so I said, I've got to put the story of Nathan Hale in the book. While I was writing the book, I got a copy of the Yale Alumni magazine, and it said something about Nathan Hale on the cover. So I flipped to the page. The class of '75 created a bobblehead doll of the statue of Nathan Hale. And I thought, this is not a joke. They think this is cute. This is a statue of a man, 21 years old, with his hands bound behind his back. He's about to step into eternity for his country, giving his life. He says the most noble thing, I only wish I had, you know, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. And just to show you how far away from these things we have come, the class of '75 thought it would be cute and whimsical. That's the term they used in the rebuttal to my statement, to create a bobblehead doll. And I thought, they are desecrating the memory of a man who literally gave his life for the United States of America, for the idea of liberty for all. And they didn't do this maliciously. They just have no idea of what these things mean. And I thought, we are at that place in a culture. We're so far removed. If we don't get back to the basics immediately, it is game over for the United States. That sounds draconian, but the fact is, this is true.
I believe it is. Eric, the book is called If You Can Keep It, ladies and gentlemen. It's available where books are sold, and you can also get it through cbn.com, but you really, this is the kind of thing we've got to learn. We have to learn where we came from. We have to learn what the founders of this nation believed, and we've got to learn what virtue is here. So we appreciate Eric. God bless you. He's a great author. He's written some tremendous books, and Bonhoeffer's one of them, and others that you have written.
Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
God bless.
God bless you.
The anniversary of the first time an American president took the oath of office, and an event honoring George Washington is also bringing together big names in politics and the evangelical community and a national celebration of prayer. Since our founding in 1776, the United States has only known 44 presidents, from Barack Obama to George Washington. And arguably, few have had a more lasting impact than the country's first, a Revolutionary War hero who served as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and a man who's revered as the father of the nation. All over the Capitol, George Washington's legacy is apparent in monuments and statues. The city's even his namesake. But for the organizer of an upcoming event honoring the country's first president, Washington was more than a founding father. He set many precedents, none more important, he says, than a public profession of faith in a divine God.
After being sworn in there at Federal Hall, he placed his hand upon an open Bible and he pledged an oath before God and the nation to uphold the Constitution.
George Washington, immediately after he took the oath of office under the Constitution, leaned down, picked up his Bible, and kissed the Bible. From there, he invited his vice president, his cabinet, to follow him.
They walked down the street to St. Paul's Chapel, where they had divine services, and there in that service, America was dedicated to God.
This year marks the 225th anniversary of Washington's first inauguration, which will be commemorated by a prayer event in the U.S. Capitol. Minnesota Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann is this year's congressional host.
It's an overlooked day, but we are not going to overlook it. This is a seminal moment, and we as members of Congress are inviting the nation to come back and remember this very great man, more importantly, what he did. He dedicated our nation to the glory of God.
Now, in its third year, Washington, a man of prayer, brings together members of the House and Senate to pray for the nation and its leaders. CBN News interviewed the event's founder at Washington's historic Mount Vernon home.
And it is our hopes and desires that having this event, Washington, a Man of Prayer, on May 7th, will bring attention to the fact that not only was our nation founded upon the principles of God's Word, but it was also a moment for all men around the world, because for the last 225 years, men from all nations, all creeds, all colors have desired to come to America.
The event, emceed by former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, is only for members of Congress. But this year, the prayer will be beamed into homes and churches on the Daystar television network. It will also be available on a live webcast, inviting Americans to join with the prayers of their leaders for America to return to its Christian heritage.
700 million homes have access to their viewing, and we are just trusting God that He will allow the world to see members of the Senate, members of the House, noted Christian leaders acknowledge George Washington as a man of faith, a man of prayer.
And you can watch Washington, a Man of Prayer. It will air next Wednesday, May 7th from 8:30 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time on the Daystar Television Network, and you can see it online at cbn.com.
This time of year, Americans are used to celebrating the nation's birthday and its greatness, but they may soon be mourning its downfall. That's the conclusion of researcher George Barna and historian David Barton in their book, U-Turn, Restoring America to the Strength of Its Roots.
These authors say that the U.S. is entering its own version of the Dark Ages, that any civilization that's gone where America is headed now has gone to ruin.
The founders gave us an amazing foundation, and for us to trample on it and say we're going to build a new one is folly.
The authors point out those early Americans were shaped by the Bible and a Judeo-Christian worldview.
They believed everybody should read through the Bible cover to cover once a year. That's what we did in school. That's what we did in spiritual life. That's what political leaders did. Not today. We can't even get Christians to read that word.
Today, only 30% of Christians read the Bible and less than 10% from cover to cover. And it shows.
Only 9% of born-again Christians have a biblical worldview. Only 51% of pastors have a biblical worldview.
It's led to a complete change in values over 240 years. Then, service to others ruled the day.
Your order of responsibilities is God, country, and family. And so that's part of the biblical thinking they had, which is why the Founding Fathers were told, and specifically taught in schools, we have their textbooks, if someone comes to you and say, we need you to run for office, you're not allowed to say no. You said, I will run. Because, as they point out, your life doesn't belong to you.
Today, it's all about me.
Now we're just worried about comfort and experiences and entertainment and security.
That's led to a world of things that can pile up the kind of debt that can kill a country.
The average American family, they're looking usually at a mortgage debt of about $130,000. They're usually looking at credit card debt of about $21,000. They're looking at a car debt of about $23,000, a college loan debt of about $24,000. And so we're so far in debt that we tolerate it in others.
Like our federal government.
Where we are right now, it will take 107 years of the full production of the American economy to pay off the debt we have right now. We are at a point now where 60% of Americans receive more from the government than what they put in. You can't sustain that.
Compare that to what Thomas Jefferson said.
We can live in debt and extravagance, but we'll be in slavery, or we can be free, but we have to use frugality. George Washington said, avoid occasions of expense. If you want to stay out of debt, just quit spending. And so the Founding Fathers very, very, very clear that what would destroy a nation is debt.
So where's that indicate America's headed?
Into the ash heap of history.
Reverend Sam Rohr invited Barna and Barton to address this gathering of the Pennsylvania Pastors Network because he wants a different outcome.
God's judgment on America and his hand of judgment, which is very obviously here, will put us down on our knees until we look up.
Church folks often say, look at what those people are doing to wreck our country. But Barna and Barton found in their research over and over again that church people are just as guilty as their government, as secular people, of the same kind of ruinous behaviors that are taking the nation down.
In a country that between 78–80% say they're Christian, but only 34% believe in absolute moral truth.
Barna on a regular basis asks Christians and non-Christians about 70 moral categories. And these days, he's finding no substantive statistical difference between Christians and non-Christians when it comes to most moral issues.
Stop pointing the finger and look at ourselves and say, are we really the church that Christ died on the cross for?
Rohr says the church should be confessing to God.
We are the problem. We have walked away from you, and the culture has followed us, not the other way around.
Barna says today's Americans believe they're smarter than the founders, maybe because of education and technology. But the founders had that biblical foundation.
They didn't have all the things that we think are necessary to have a sophisticated society today. But the key isn't sophistication. You know, it's wisdom, it's discernment, it's love, it's grace.
And so until we get back into God's plan and know what his plan is, we'll never get the nation back to where it needs to be.
Today we think that mankind has evolved. We're smarter and wiser than those people who founded the country hundreds of years ago. And yet they were so wise that they founded the greatest nation on the earth, while today's generation are well on their way to losing it. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from Lancaster Bible College.
I regret that I have only one life to give for my country. That was the statement of America's most famous spy, but there are some others, Hidden Heroes. And we have a book about a secret spy ring that may have helped turn the war at a crucial time of our fight for independence. And that story is told on a book that is now number 6 on Amazon. It's called The Secret Six by Brian Kilmeade and his associate Don Yeager. And Brian is here with us right after we have this.
When George Washington's Continental Army lost the Battle of Brooklyn Heights in August 1776 and then went on to lose control of Manhattan, it looked like the Revolutionary War might be over and the Americans defeated. In the end, though, Washington's army made a comeback and was ultimately victorious. But it wasn't because of the Continental Army's superior military might. It was because of a little-known group of 5 men and 1 woman known as the Culpeper Spy Ring. Fox and Friends host and history buff Brian Kilmeade uncovers the bravery and heroism of these clandestine spies in his new book, George Washington's Secret Six, The Spy Ring That Saved the American Revolution.
You never heard of them, did you? Until today. Brian is going to bring it out. He's here with us. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Hey, listen, it reads like an adventure story. It's very exciting. The Secret Six, the Culper, after Culpeper, the Culper ring, was that what they?
Yeah, Culpeper County, right around where George Washington grew up, so they shortened it to Culper. The original guy was Samuel Culper, and then they said, let's make him Culper Sr. Let's make Robert Townsend, the dry goods keeper, Culper Jr. And then all of them would have pseudonames, and they'd work for 3.5 years behind closed doors, and Washington, as far as we could tell, only met 3 of them, but he had their trust, and they trusted Washington, and we have their letters, and we know what they've actually accomplished.
Well, the key guy, the military man, was what, a Major Talmadge, wasn't he? Wasn't he the one that was sort of driving the show, or not?
Pat, this guy belongs in your founder's hotel. I'm telling you, Major Talmadge is a guy that everybody should Google right now, because here's a guy who was by Washington's side. You're not needing a third person to interpret who Washington was. He wrote it down. His kids urged him to. 77-page biography. He was the one who landed, who came from Long Island, who went there, and Washington said, find people we can trust. He found a farmer, Abraham Woodhull. He found a longshoreman in Caleb Brewster. He found a bar owner, tavern owner in Austin Row. And then later he would find a dry goods owner named Robert Townsend. He was the guy that was top secret until the 1930s. And we didn't really give him his proper due because of the Depression and World War II. But as you piece it all together, when I stumbled onto it, I just couldn't believe it wasn't unwound before.
Are we going to give him something? Give him a monument or something in Washington?
We really should. You know what I did in the book, and I know you noticed, is I took a picture of Robert Townsend's grave.
Oh, okay.
And he's in the back of a barn. And it's a family grave, nondescript. No one visits, the original headstone. And all those people in Arlington belong there, but so does he. He belongs with more pomp and circumstance.
A lot of people have bad-mouthed Washington. They said, well, he was running all the time. Every time he turned around, he lost battles, he lost battles, he lost Manhattan. And the thing hung by a thread, didn't it? The whole American experiment could have been snuffed out in a couple of bad battles, right?
Absolutely. And the thing is, you got to run because you know your fight's got to wait to another day. They had one big battle. It didn't go well. So Washington said, we can outlast these guys. We're stubborn. We know what we want. They cannot last here for long. We're going to beat them down. They threw in more troops. They had up to 90,000. Washington hung at the top at 9,000. How did he do it? He outthought him. He outspied him. In fact, the first quote in this book is from Major Beckworth. And he said, Washington didn't outfight us. He outspied us. And you have to understand, I think you know better than anybody because you're such a student of history, you have to know when to fight and when to get out. Because if you sit there and say, well, we fight as men, well, no, you lose. So that's what he had to do in the Battle of Brooklyn, escape to Manhattan, where magically a fog appeared, allowing him to sneak out across the East River into Manhattan and ultimately get out to fight another day. And the day he leaves Manhattan, when he gets permission from the Congress in Philadelphia, 9/11. So on 9/11, he gets permission to leave. Little do we know what 9/11 would mean hundreds of years later.
Unbelievable. You've got an interesting story in there about those Hessians. You know, he went across the Delaware River and made that incredible attack. And there was another spy that set that deal up. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, Honeyman worked with George Washington in the French-Indian War. And then when this broke out between the British and the emerging Americans, he decides, I'll work for the British. And he's a butcher, and he's helping out one day. Well, one day he just happens to get captured by Washington himself. And then he goes to prison, and he magically gets out. And when he gets out, he's so relieved to go to the Hessians. He says, guys, I know it's Christmas. Keep eating. Keep drinking. I was just with the Americans, man. Those guys are a mess. They got no plans. They're going to fall apart. You know what the truth was? They were coming over to take over the whole camp, and he was a double agent. He was planted back with the Hessians because Washington began his magical spy activity, really with Honeyman.
And the Hessians were drunk then on Christmas Eve. They were having a big party.
Yes, they were between half drunk and half hungover. Not a good combination.
That's the worst.
of all.
That's what I think. I wouldn't know, but that's what I hear.
I'm sure.
Right.
Well, trust me, it's true.
And a lot of those Hessians wanted to be us anyway. A lot of them stuck around, and we treated them great. And they said, "Hey, you know what? These Americans aren't bad." And they ended up, they were hired guns.
Did the couple ring? Were they? We started out with the one who said, "I've only got one life to live," but he wasn't part of this ring. He was the progenitor.
It took a year. It took a year for Washington, and he was devastated by Hale's death. He was a school teacher, Yale grad, who came over here majestically, but without any espionage knowledge. Caught in a couple of days, hung at 66 and 3rd, right in Manhattan. There's a little plaque there by the labels for less, or whatever it is, where he was hung. And then what he did is, I'm going to take a year, but I'm not going to do a guy, I'm going to do a ring. And this ring is going to stay underground. And they're going to have a way to communicate in which if they are caught, they will not necessarily be killed or the others won't be dragged down. Okay. He used invisible ink. He used encryption. He used dead drops. And I went to Langley, Virginia. Yeah. And I asked the CIA, I said, guys, am I overstating this? Is there a book here? And he goes, not only aren't you overstating it, what they learned in the middle of the war, we treat our agents before we even send them on any mission today. So these are average, everyday citizens. And, Pat, I know you can understand this. My message is this. A bartender, a farmer, a dry goods owner, a socialite, and a printer. They did great things for an extraordinary cause. We know Washington's great. We know about all these other guys, but there was extraordinary people, so-called ordinary people, who did great things.
What about Benedict Arnold? You've got a lot of material about him and Major Andre. You want to talk about that?
Well, the big mystery in our book is 355. It's a woman. Everybody had numbers. Washington was 711. Woodhull, the farmer, was 712. Townsend, the dry goods owner, was 714. She was 355. We believe she got close to Major Andre. Keep in mind, Major Andre and Benedict Arnold were working together to turn over West Point. It would have destroyed us. We would have lost the Hudson and lost the war. So we believe that she infiltrated there, the social circles, got word out to Talmadge, look out, there's a major officer about to turn sides to a loyalist. So he was on the lookout in that entire region. And he brought it to his grave exactly what took place. But Talmadge was able to eyeball Major Andre, who was detained by 2 vagrants, and said, this is not who he says he is. This is no average, everyday British citizen. Okay. This is a guy that is about to link up with Arnold. They found in his sock the letter that was supposed to go to Arnold. They unearthed the whole thing. Arnold barely escapes, but they stopped West Point from going to the bad guys at that time, which was the British.
What was in Arnold's craw? What got him off? I mean, he was supposed to be a very highly regarded officer.
To me, in my humble opinion, I always think that he always felt as though he was getting the short end of the stick from not getting paid for his great expedition up in Canada. I feel as though that he wanted Washington's commission. He didn't get it. He's walking with a limp and he was wounded, wasn't paid for. And he just said, you know what, I'm going to go to West Point. And I have a sense that the winners of this war are going to be the British. And I'm then going to get the acclaim I deserve. He picked wrong again. And that's pretty much, he actually abandoned his family and left him at West Point to escape on his own. So that does reveal a little bit of his character. But he did show tremendous valor in battle.
Major Andre, though, they caught and hanged, right?
Right. And he was a charismatic guy, I understand, that was not disliked by anybody. But they said, Washington said, listen, we'll give you Andre back. You give us Arnold back. And General Clinton said, I can't do that swap. He goes, well, then he dies. And Andre came out, thought he was going to get swapped. They said, no, you're going to die. And he said, can I get shot in the firing squad? And they said, no, you're going to be hanged. And he said, all right. And that Major Talmadge writes about that because he was there, and he was roommates with Nathan Hale. You talk about closing the circle.
Unbelievable.
Isn't it amazing?
Yeah.
I get chills looking at it. I don't pretend to be this great historian. I am just an American that wanted to tell this story, and by hunting it down.
It's a fun story. Last thing, whatever happened to those guys when it was all finished? They just kind of blended back into the population?
They did. I think Woodhull became a judge. Austin Rowe kept the bar. It's a great business. Robert Townsend never got his act together. We have letters from his older brother saying, Robert, the war's over. Come on. My humble opinion, PTSD. I think the 3.5 years of constant struggle. And then Rivington ended up leaving, going back to England and not really having much acclaim. We know what happened with Arnold. And 355 died, we believe, before the war ended. When Arnold got back into the city, I believe she was targeted right away.
Was she killed?
Yeah, we believe she was killed. By the paperback, we think we could be very close to her name. I hooked up with the Townsend family. They gave me hundreds, 1 week ago, they gave me hundreds of pages of family stuff. They go, we're going to get to the bottom of this. So everybody's into it.
Well, it's fun. Well, it's a mystery story, and it's number 6 and moving up to 1. I hope Brian, it's a great success.
Well, there's no book tour that would be complete without stopping. And then one of the things I look forward to most is saying, let's go to the 700 Club as soon as it came out. And this is great. And I'm so jealous of these facilities.
Gorgeous.
Look at this. It's incredible. You could land a plane in this place.
Right, well, you can move Fox and Friends down here. We'd love to have you.
Believe me, we come once, we're not leaving. Yeah.
Good to have you with us, man. Well, here it is. George Washington's Secret Six is available wherever books are sold, and we appreciate Brian being here with us. God bless you. It's good to see you, buddy.
You make this hosting thing look too easy. You're making me look bad.
If I give you some lessons, I'm in it for 52 years. I should have learned something. All right.